Start the recording. Great. So welcome everyone to tonight's event. I'm Jenna Lacqua. I am Executive Director of the History Project, and I'm so pleased to welcome you here. For those of you who aren't familiar with us and our work, the History Project is Boston's LGBTQ community archives. We're a 501c3, we're an independent archives, and we exist to document, preserve, and share LGBTQ history. So if you're interested in queer history in the Boston area, please look us up on social media, look at our website, and please support our work either by donating your own materials if you're a queer person in the area to make sure that you're documented as part of our history, or make a donation to the organization. Like I said, we're completely independent LGBTQ community archives, and thank you to those of you tonight who already donated as part of this event. So I'm sort of overseeing administration tonight. Otherwise, our board member, Jessica Taylor, will be emceeing. And with that, Jessica, I turn it over to you.
Hello, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. And thank you to Tim and Kamille for coming out and talking with us about this. So I guess we'll just get started. 2020 is the 100th anniversary of the secret court at Harvard. In broad, it was a secret tribunal investigating gay life on campus that ended up expelling, I believe, 8 students, forcing the resignation of an assistant in philosophy, and led to a suicide. And it wasn't until 2002 that this history was rediscovered by a student journalist, Amit Pali, and it wasn't until this year that I learned about it. I'm a relative newcomer to the area in any case, but when I arrived here and I started working, I worked at Harvard for 2 years, I didn't hear about it. So it was very interesting to me when I got email from Tim and Kamille about the commemorations they're doing for the 100th anniversary and the things that they're organizing for that. I knew that the History Project and people who are interested in the History Project would really be interested in hearing about the history of the secret court, how people found out about it, and what it means today. So thank you so much for Tim and Kamille for coming to talk with us. I'm going to let Kamille and Tim tell you about their thoughts and what they have to say about the secret court. But first, I'm going to introduce both of them. Kamille Washington is a current student in the mid-career MPA program at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. She received her bachelor's degree in the comparative study of religion from Harvard in 2010. She's a former president of the Harvard Gender and Sexuality Caucus, Harvard's LGBTQIA+ alumni organization, and she's also one half of the Unfriendly Black Hotties, a podcast about the intersection of race, gender, sexuality in higher ed, pop culture, and politics. And back on the go. So check that out too. Timothy Patrick McCarthy is an award-winning historian, educator, and human rights activist who's taught on faculty at Harvard since 2005. He's the author or editor of 5 books from the New Press, including the forthcoming Stonewall's Children, Living Queer History in an Age of Liberation, Loss, and Love. He was a founding member of Barack Obama's National LGBT Leadership Council and gave expert testimony to the Pentagon Comprehensive Working Group on the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. So this is going to be really a conversation. I wanted to open up with asking both of you maybe to tell us a little bit about the secret court and what you think we should know about it and kind of how you found out about it.
All right. Thank you so much, Jessica and Joan and the History Project for inviting both of us. Kamille and I decided how we were gonna choreograph the opening here, so that's why I'm jumping in. We had decided that about an hour ago, and we're gonna talk about a bunch of stuff related to the court, but then also zoom out, so to speak, and try to talk a bit about history and marking history and the importance of living history and so forth as we go through. But first, let me just say, in terms of the secret court, like most of us, you know, unless you were privy to an inside game that most of us were not privy to, learned about the secret court, if we did at all, in 2002, when Amit Pauly, who was an undergraduate reporter for the Harvard Crimson at the time, he's now the CEO and executive director of the Trevor Project. But Amit was this enterprising young journalist, not yet out, interestingly, who was writing for the Crimson and stumbled upon this archive labeled the secret court, and he wanted to know what that was all about. This was in 2001, 2002, when he was an undergraduate, that he was doing this work. So it's really, we've only known about this history for less than 2 decades, frankly. We've had it available to us. And so what he found out, he was very enterprising, much more. I mean, he wasn't just an investigative journalist. He was a historian when he was young, and he went into these records. And first, he had to fight to get access to them because the university was not interested in making these archives publicly available, even within Harvard, much less to the broader public. And so he had to fight to get access to the records, and then found in the records that they were deeply redacted. And so they had to, he and a whole team of undergraduate reporters had to do the work of kind of, you know, the sleuthing to figure out who these people were that were behind the kind of black boxes of the redactions. And what he found was this incredible story about a secret tribunal separate from Harvard's administrative board, which is still to this day, its formal administrative disciplinary board. This was a 5-person court that was chaired by or presided over by Chester Noyes Greeno, who was the acting dean of Harvard College at the time, and then 4 other members of the faculty and administration. Robert Lee, who was a professor of hygiene, he was a doctor's professor of hygiene. Matthew Luce, who was the university regent at the time. Edward R. Gray and Kenneth Murdoch, both of whom were young assistant deans. And so these 5 men were charged by President A. Lawrence Lowell, the president of Harvard at the time, to investigate what they had discovered or come to know as a kind of homosexual cabal that was carrying on in various ways in one dormitory in Perkins 28, which becomes a very important sort of location of what happens. This was all precipitated by, it wasn't as if they were sort of looking for this, it was precipitated by the suicide of a young undergraduate named Cyril Wilcox. Cyril Wilcox was an undergraduate from Fall River, Massachusetts, who committed suicide in May of 2020, I'm sorry, of 1920, May of 1920. And right before he had committed suicide, and there was some concern over what exactly had happened, but it was declared a suicide and deemed a suicide right before, the day before he committed suicide in his home that his mother discovered him dead in the bedroom. He had come out essentially to his older brother, who had also been a Harvard student, George Wilcox. George Wilcox then, after Cyril committed suicide, intercepted 2 pieces of mail that were from students who were involved in this sort of community, this what we might now call a kind of queer community at Harvard. And he intercepted these letters. In one of the letters, it had identified a man named Harry Dreyfus, who was an older gentleman, about 8 or 9, 10 years older than Cyril, with whom he was having a kind of on and off relationship. George went to find Harry Dreyfus in downtown Boston, right? He worked at a cafe that was known as a sort of a gay space where people would gather. He beat him up, extorted more names out of him, and then took the letters and the names to Dean Greeno, with whom he met at Harvard, that set in motion this entire thing. So a brother who the younger brother had come out to had known about his homosexuality, intercepted mail after his suicide, went and committed a hate crime, extorted names from this guy, and then went and outed all of these people to the dean of Harvard College. That's what precipitated the secret court. Then the court was constituted. It lasted for about 2 weeks in the late weeks of May and June of 1920. President Lowell was very, very active in this court, and all of the decisions were made final through him. And they conducted 30 interviews with 30 different people, including many of the people who were ultimately expelled from Harvard. They ended up expelling 8 students, 7 undergraduates and 1 graduate student, a junior faculty member, and then also disciplining an alum, a recent alum who had come through Harvard. And these folks were sent away. They were cast not only from campus, but they were expelled from the city of Cambridge as well. And when they returned to the city of Cambridge, they were subject to fines and charges as a result of that. Only 2 of these students were readmitted. The entire scenario, the entire history of the secret court, from Cyril Wilcox's suicide until the later years, 3 of these folks committed suicide as a result of this. Cyril Wilcox, Keith Smearage, who was one of the undergraduates, and Eugene Cummings, who was the graduate student in dentistry, who committed suicide actually right before he was to find out that he was going to be expelled by the secret court. And so this was a very dark and difficult history in Harvard's past. It's also a history about queer community and queer space and queer joy. We'll get into that in a second. But it's something that the university has had to kind of reckon with now that we know the essential details and more about this particular episode. This year, as you can see, is the centennial and the 100th anniversary, and so we decided to get involved with commemorating it and using it as an opportunity to have a broader set of discussions. Kamille?
So I actually found out about the secret court essentially through my connection to Tim. I really had no sense of any particular LGBTQ history at Harvard. And I have been around Harvard for a while, like 15 years, a while, and I had never heard about it. And Tim invited me to join this Harvard Secret Court Centennial Committee. And my first thought was, yes, obviously I want to take part in this. And my second thought was, well, what the hell is the secret court? So I went and I read the Crimson piece that Amy Polly had written, and it's a really great piece. I encourage all of you to read it. And then I also read the Wikipedia article, and I was just blown away that this story was so kind of sporadically known. And there was so much in the story that really resonated with me personally. As has already been discussed, there is this thread of mental illness and suicidality that runs through the story of the court. The investigation began because of a suicide, and then at the end of the whole affair, these 2 other students had died by suicide. And that's obviously something that remains a big issue in our community today. And I just felt like we have to be able to do better. We have to be able to create spaces in which we queer people can be well. And our schools and our institutions, like, we should be able to count on them to help us to be well and to create some of those spaces for us. So that really drew me into the work of sharing this story, and then also using this story to build up some momentum, to advocate for some long overdue changes at the institution, and to press for, more work into these so-called marginalized histories. And the actions of the university administration in this case didn't surprise me necessarily, because we know that institutions are inherently conservative. Like, they all are, that's just part of their DNA. But some of the things that came out in these testimonies that you can read were just truly, truly shocking. So, for example, it's 1920, Prohibition has just started in, I believe, January of that same year. So the secret court is getting going in May of 1920. Now, there were allegations of drinking on campus that were raised when the secret court was convening. And despite that fact, alcohol is completely disallowed. The secret court seemed to care about that not at all. Instead, the court had this kind of obsession with the self-pleasure habits of these students who, keep in mind, these are college juniors and seniors, are essentially children. And the court asked a number of the students whether or not they masturbated, how often they masturbated, when was the last time they masturbated. And it just reflected to me this baffling fixation on this imaginary link between masturbation and homosexuality. So a question I have for you, Tim, is there a bigger historical context to that piece of it that I'm missing here beyond simple prudishness? What was that all about?
Yeah, it's interesting that you would raise the point about, you know, they knew that they were drinking, right? What they called these souse parties, right? Sauce, like that they referred to as alcohol parties. They were souse, like house parties, souse parties. And yet that was not the thing that they were so upset about. It was the masturbation and all the other things. And so you were the first one to kind of make that dot connection when we spoke earlier in preparation for this. And I think it's a really interesting thing. Like, what are they actually obsessed about, right? It's actually against the law to drink in the country, constitutionally illegal to drink, and yet not constitutionally illegal to masturbate, right? It's never been constitutionally illegal to masturbate. And what I think it shows us in this archive, because they literally asked every single one of these students whether or not they masturbate and how often, to the point where some of them had to say, I haven't masturbated in 7 years. I haven't masturbated since I was in high school. I mean, literally being forced to give a kind of historical record of their wanking. And so it's, to me, what it represents is, through this archive, is the kind of construction of deviance and ultimately of criminality that comes through in various kinds of sexual behaviors, which has been a through line in the history of sexuality and gender and of LGBTQ history throughout the United States. I mean, think about it. In 2003, the Lawrence and Garner versus Texas case was the first time the Supreme Court finally said that consenting homosexual adults had the right to privacy, do whatever they wanted between themselves. And when the Supreme Court ruled in Lawrence versus Texas, overriding the 1986 ruling Bowers versus Hardwick, they were saying that basically anti-sodomy laws were unconstitutional. And at the time in 2003, there were still 13 states with anti-sodomy laws on the books in that moment, including Texas, which is where, of course, the case was. So there's a long history of the state and of institutions infiltrating and insinuating themselves into private spaces to police sexual conduct. And so any sexual conduct that can be seen as deviant or can be constructed as deviant then gets articulated in that way, and it gets codified and it gets used against them. So I think masturbation in this case, right, was the way, at least my reading of the archive is, if we can't prove that they're actually buggering each other, but we can prove that they're masturbating together, then we can get them, right? We have something, right? If we can't actually prove other kinds of sexual activity that would be more penetrative, say, right, then we can use this as the suspicion that's enough for us to expel them. And this is true later on in the blue discharges that take place during and after World War II in the military, where there's suspicion of sexual activity. One of those forms of sexual activity is masturbation in the barracks. That masturbation becomes a way for people to be targeted as deviant in that way. There's another piece of it, though, that I think is really important, and this relates to kind of gender and sexuality and the larger ideas about gender roles in families, right? Masturbation is a non-procreative form of sexual activity, right, in that way. And so it too is deviant in that way because it doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't produce a child, right? There isn't a way in which the kind of ejaculation that might come from any kind of sexual intercourse would then produce, right, something normal or something expected. And so I think it's all of those things that are kind of wrapped up in this. But to me, it shows us a kind of early way where any kind of sexuality that they want to construct as deviant then gets constructed in these kinds of official and institutional settings, right? Kamille, I had a question for you about you brought up something in our conversation, our many conversations about this, about the Perkins 28 as a space, as a queer space. And you were saying, you know, it's somewhat remarkable that these, you know, gay men, although one of the things that's interesting about the archive is it's hard to know exactly how they might have defined their sexuality, right? There are people who resist certain categories, other people lean into them, some people write about them privately in letters, but they testify differently to the secret court, right? So they're kind of all over the place. They're calling them faggots, queers, gays, buggerers, right? All of it, onanists, right? All of these terms. And yet you've seen something here about like the power of joy, right? There's joy there, you know, preceding the inquiry or the inquisition. Can you talk a little bit about why that strikes you and why that resonates with you?
Yeah, I mean, part of why it struck me was like, I was not out when I was in college, and I was like, maybe if I had a Perkins 28, I might have been. I mean, but there's still this preponderance of like queer spaces, not just on campuses, but also like, you know, in the world. And I just felt like it's kind of amazing that in 1920, these men were coming together to hook up, to experiment with their gender presentation. Like some of them were dressing up as women, and having these, and drinking, and having these really fabulous parties together. I was like, I want to be invited to a Perkins 28 party. It sounds so great. Yeah. And they created this physical space for themselves in this room on campus, Perkins 28. And the records of the court also mention a couple of other like clubs in Boston, one the Rooster and the other the Lighted Lamp. And it underscores that this wasn't even just a Harvard thing, or even just a Cambridge thing. There was this connection to communities in Beacon Hill and elsewhere in Boston. And so like Cyril Wilcox's lover, as you were saying, Harry Dreyfus, I mean, he essentially lived with Cyril Wilcox, or Cyril Wilcox essentially lived with Harry Dreyfus. He was in and out of that apartment all the time. And then there were these three other men who are named, who are completely unaffiliated with the university. And it's amazing that these community links really existed. And knowing that, it frustrates me a little bit that so much of the conversation around the court tends to focus on the really negative, awful outcomes, the expulsions and the suicides, which are of course important and should be honored and remembered and rectified perhaps. But you see this a lot, you know, when we talk about stories of queerness. There's that whole, you know, kill your gays trope, right? Like there's often this lingering sadness that pervades everything that touches queer life. We see it in the ways we tell our own history, we see it in our fiction, and it can feel oppressive. So why do you think that we have this tendency to focus so much on the bad things? And, you know, what's the fascination when there is this joy to be found in lived experience as well?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And I struggle with how to answer it because I have two impulses, right? One impulse is to say, you know, we have to document and narrate the pain, right? That comes from discrimination, and that comes from violence, and that comes from a history of this nation for most of its history that has been explicit in its anti-LGBTQ violence and discrimination. And that is, I mean, there are many, many groups of people living at many different intersections, right, who have suffered and experienced violence, discrimination, all of these things that I think has to be illuminated and documented in the clear light of day. And I think that's one of the things that's happening right now in the United States with this profound racial reckoning that's long overdue, frankly. And yet it's impossible to ignore. And so I think that part of the role of historians and of activists within, and of ordinary folks within communities, it's part of our role to lay that all bare and to demand that it be reckoned with, right? So that's one way I go with this, is like, fine, like narrate the pain, right? Like force people to confront it and reckon with it. And then there's the other piece of it, which is like, which I know from archival work. And also I know from my own life, right? You just said, like, you weren't out in college, you wish you had Perkins 28. I wasn't out in college either. I remember when Peter Gomes and Marjorie Garber and Anthony Appia and Diana Eck and all these folks came out at Harvard because of this homophobic magazine that was published when I was a junior. I went to the rally as an ally with a shirt on that said straight but not narrow. I mean, talk about an archival source right now. I mean, I'm queer as Christmas on Easter now. And it's like, I too would have loved a Perkins 28. I'm sure they existed. I wasn't invited to those parties. And yet, in my own life since then, right, I have experienced all sorts of moments of joy, right, in public and private settings, and in ways that I know are absolutely true and are absolutely part of the liberatory tradition and experience of our people, right? And so I think, so yeah, I want to get at the joy too, which in some cases, particularly in these moments of deep repression and oppression, right, often and only take place in private spaces because they're the only places that are even reasonably safe. Right, is another way that this story, another lesson I think this story has to tell us. And yet, and then of course you have increasingly public forms of joy, right? And pride marches and, all sorts of public displays of things when it becomes more safe, at least for some of us, to do that, right? And so I want a history that contains multitudes, that allows us to get at the kind of pain and struggle, the oppression and the suffering, and also accommodates the joy and the liberation and the love and all of those other things that are absolutely part of it too. And that actually, I think we would agree on this, that is the fuel for the struggle, right? That's so often what we can gather up and soak up in those moments of joy is the stuff that gives us the fortitude to be resilient when we get into the arena, when we have to go back into that public or political battle for struggling for literally a recognition of our humanity and dignity and decency, if not rights and equality and freedom. I wanted to ask you, Kamille, to talk a little bit about this, because you just recently, as part of this Secret Court 100 series that we're putting together, both curated and hosted an event on Black queer Harvard, in which you talked about many things. Reverend Fleming, Professor Higginbotham, Professor Evelyn Hammonds, Professor Robert Reed Farr. You had this amazing conversation about Black queer Harvard, and both historically and in the present day. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that space, which felt to me one where you were reckoning with all of the things about a Black queer past, but also including very centrally joy and love and a deep community that I felt as an audience member was quite beautiful.
I so appreciate the opportunity to continue to process and reflect on that conversation. It was so rich. And I was really honored to have shared in that amazing conversation, but there was a way in which I was like, well, how come I have to put this together? And like, why does it take this like Herculean effort of like a couple of people to make something as simple as a community conversation about like, yes, Black queer Harvard history, but like, that's everyone's history. Like, why does it have to be this like niche thing? And I think the same could be said of LGBTQ history in general. But I began that conversation kind of wanting to do a lot of like work around intellectual lineage and like I want to have this academic conversation around the facts of Harvard's Black queer history, because I really didn't know any. I was like, I know about Elaine Locke. That's kind of the extent of my like knowledge of notable Black, queer folk at the institution. And I was delighted when the conversation turned and became this like much more personal and emotional discussion. And the panelists, they spoke really beautifully about their own journeys as Black queer folk and like that intersection and the challenges that they faced and the joys that they faced in that as well. Reverend Fleming was talking about, creating this like kind of Black queer theology and like space in which to practice that and create this like welcoming, like, virtual church that takes in everyone and thinks about those intersections. I just thought that is so incredible. And we also talked about, how to find your way at a very traditional, predominantly white institution. And I had this question about exclusive histories. So, like, how do we remember a Black queer Harvard, which we cannot access in its entirety because it has not been valued the same way that other histories of Harvard have been? And Robert Reed Farr had this really compelling response where he basically said, look, the history is there. It's hiding in the open. And we just have to do the work of unearthing it. And that conversation was a little bit more than a week ago, and I'm still mulling on that challenge. I take that call to action really seriously, but there's something in there that bugged me. I mean, and this takes us kind of back to Amit Pauly's discovery of the secret court. Like, he wasn't looking for it, he happened upon it. And when he did, he had to overcome all of these barriers to get at this history that should have been available to everyone already. And so for me, like, my resistance to that call is like, well, whose work is it to make their way through these kinds of institutional records? Like, what can we do to be the authors of our own history in real time? And like, how, like, we have to grapple with the fact that this burden, like, we are shouldering this burden perhaps unfairly, right? Like yes, it is our history that as queer people, this history of the secret court, but it's also all of Harvard's history. That's staying on the entire institution's record. That's not just an LGBTQ thing. Mm-hmm. So I don't know, what are your thoughts on that, Tim? Who's supposed to be writing? Whose job is it? Whose job is it to do this work? And how should we think about that?
Well, so often in the historical record, right? I mean, there's the old cliche that the winners write history. And I think there's some truth to that. And so, for many, many years, the history of this country was told in a kind of master narrative of captains of industry and presidents and generals and the people who, quote unquote, mattered. And then that leaves out, of course, the vast, vast, vast majority of people generally, and certainly all of the people who are from marginalized communities or minoritized communities in some way. And so in many ways, the work of historical transformation, of historical revision, is our work to do, right? And I mean, from my perspective, it's sort of what void exists and how can we fill it, right? Is it possible to find the stories that will fill the gaps in the larger narrative? And then also, once we have stories that are countervailing stories to the master narratives, right? Like, how do we continually critique those so that we're always moving and churning and revising? I think that's really, really, really important. I mean, Robert Reed Farr's point about, it's there, it's so true. I mean, anyone who's done, and the History Project has been doing this work, anybody who's done archival work, and I'm not one of those people. I have colleagues who think that only, people with PhDs can be historians or, scholars in some way, or intellectuals, and I'm definitely not one of those people. And so I actually think that communities have a responsibility to preserve and promote, right, and to constantly rewrite their own histories. The History Project is a perfect example of precisely that public history work that's so important, that comes from community. And there are so many examples of that in the LGBTQ community, in different intersections within the LGBTQ community, in the African American community, the labor movement, the women's movement. There's so many different movements have been the first places where the first histories have been told. Right? I started my work in graduate school doing African American history. I wrote my dissertation on the abolitionist movement, and the first African American histories of the United States were written by people like William Wells Brown and William Cooper Nell. and other folks who were the intellectuals. David Walker, in his appeal, writes a whole history about the founding of the AME Church, and he rewrites the master narrative of white America to have its roots in the founding origins of Black people and of the Haitian Revolution. These weren't things any white person was talking about in the United States. White people still don't talk about this stuff in the United States, but certainly not in 1827, 1829. And so sometimes the movement and the communities that fuel the movements are the places where the histories start to work. With respect to something like the secret court, we have an extra hurdle, right? Whenever you're talking about a university archive, right, you're talking about barriers to entry, barriers to access. And then when you talk about a university-based archive that is literally tucked off in a corner, heavily redacted, and it's not even in the search engine, right? You can't even find it. You have to be really enterprising to find this stuff. You're talking about additional barriers to that. But once you're in there, it's a treasure trove. Right. And when I first started researching the abolitionist movement, and I remember there was like an offhanded reference that William Lloyd Garrison wrote in something in the Liberator in like 1833 about this guy, David Walker, who had died mysteriously. And I was like, who's that? And so I started to go to find David Walker. And then I was like, oh, David Walker wrote this pamphlet. Oh, David Walker worked for this Black newspaper that preceded William Lloyd Garrison's Liberator, right? And then I started, and that unleashed a whole community of Black radicals dating back to the period of the Revolution that I had never heard of before, right? And that became the first half of my dissertation. And then, articles and books that I've written since and taught courses on. My course on the stories of slavery and freedom at Harvard is all about that stuff. And it was all stuff that I found in the archive that I wasn't looking for. I went in looking to study William Lloyd Garrison and the Liberator, and then found a whole Black prehistory, which was actually the Black founding history of the abolitionist movement and the rewriting of the master narrative of the nation, right? That's in there, right? I have no doubt that if we sent an army of archival, folks into Harvard's archives, that we would find its queer history in a way that we still don't have access to. And then there's other people who are doing the work of oral history, or I just saw someone, Malcolm, I think, posted a book from the class of 1962 where they did this work, gay men from the class of 1962, right? There's a book, 67, it's a book, right? There it is, they did that, right? I'm sure, I haven't read that book, but I do know of it, and I'm glad you showed it to us. That kind of stuff, again, it emerges iteratively and dynamically from within our community. So I do think we have responsibility. We can't wait, I think, for other folks to do the work, right? I think we need to do that work. But I'll also say that, I wasn't trained in this. Everything that I teach at Harvard now, my latest book, everything that I do now in LGBTQ history is self-taught. I don't have one graduate class in any of this, and I have 4 degrees. So, you got to do it yourself sometimes. And hopefully in a generation, that won't be the case anymore, but, we build and build.
Well, so to return to the archives, so these documents were heavily redacted. Mm-hmm. What do we make of restoring the redactions, right? Like, I feel like I can see an argument to go either way. I think, for me, Amit Paley did the right thing, because how can you understand the figures in these stories beyond, like, this one moment in time? How can you humanize them if you literally don't know their names? But we are talking about, it's like, are we outing these people again? Are we sort of recreating that trauma? Like, I think that's like a complicated question. I don't know that I really have an answer, but I just ask it as a provocation.
I was going to ask you what I won't ask you to answer, but you've said this, and what bothers you about it? What's at the root of your trouble there?
Well, because I do think ultimately, even now, I find the insistence for public figures to come out, it grates on me, because I think we should be allowed to be the authors of our own self-image in the world. But I do understand that when you go back to the historical record, there was no option there was no safe option to do that kind of self-authoring and self-projection and to be like out and proud. Like that just like wasn't on the table. So that complicates that question for me. But there is a way in which I'm like, well, you know, if Cyril Wilcox was, you know, if he could speak to us from beyond, like how would he feel? Like, do we care about that? Like,
yeah, it's a great question. And, you know, Eugene Cummings, who was the dentistry student he committed suicide on June 11th, and he had not been notified that he was being expelled. He was 2 weeks before graduation and killed himself in Stillman Infirmary because he had learned enough about the drugs in dentistry school that he knew what a lethal amount would be. And so he used that knowledge that he got at Harvard Dental School to commit suicide. But he didn't know that. And now the college's only major prize for LGBTQ themed history thesis in the Women in Gender and Sexuality Studies Department is named for him. It's the Cummings Prize. Mm-hmm. And, you know, how would he feel about that? I mean, maybe honored, maybe not. We'll never know that. And to me, I really take your concern very seriously because it does get into the kind of politics of outing. It also gets into the politics of what language we use to refer to ourselves and who we are and what we do and who we do in the world. You know, the language they used is not the language that we use, right? These men have all been described as homosexuals or gay. And yet we don't know if they were. For instance, Ernest Weeks Roberts got married to a woman a year after he was expelled from Harvard. He was the son of a former US congressman. He married a woman, had a child, named the child after him. So there's a junior roaming around. And then he became a really prominent interior decorator in Boston and had a wonderful marriage. And he wrote later on that he and his wife had a wonderful marriage. Is he gay? I don't know. You know, and so it runs into both of those troubles, right? About like, is it our responsibility? Are we doing some kind of violence actually on these folks from the past when we're sort of outing them beyond where they might have self-identified? And then are we doing additional, not violence, but are we doing additional something by naming them, by using our language to characterize their lived experience? And that's very tricky. That's particularly tricky, I think, for LGBTQ historians and for people who do LGBTQ history, because the language of self-identification has changed since last week, right? Much less last century. And so we have to be mindful of that. I don't think it's a perfect, I don't think we can figure it out totally. For me, illuminating the kind of queer past and giving that its due, it's in all of its richness and complexity, outweighs for me the deep concern that I have over whether or not I'm outing someone. Particularly since these folks do leave records. And I believe that historians in some ways are having a conversation with people across the grave. And I think that they're sending us signals that we then can try in our best way with great respect and responsibility to render their full lived experience in a way now that couldn't possibly have been rendered then. But we have to do it with great responsibility and great humility. And, you know, and these moral considerations that you raise, Kamille, that I think should be always at the center of our work, whether it's our intellectual and archival work, historical work, or our political work, are really, really vital.
I'm going to jump in there, Tim, because I feel like that's a great point to kind of round off the conversation and open to questions. This question of, okay, you know, now what, in some ways, right? What you're talking about is, and what about the now, right? And so I'm going to pick up on questions that people are asking. So you can raise your hands or put it in the chat. But maybe I start a little bit, I'll start off with, what are you hoping for in terms of the commemoration, right? You're doing a number of talks like this. What are you hoping comes out of it?
So I think the first big piece of it is just that people know, that people hear these names and also feel connected to this path that we've been speaking about, right? That you, not only are you not alone in the present, like there are people who have come before you. And I think that's, is a really important source of strength and resilience, and other kinds of folks have access to those histories. So why shouldn't we? So that's the first thing. We've also been trying to do a lot of work to think about like, what's the next century of queer life at the university? And integral to that is like, you know, what's wrong today? Like, what are the things that we need to fix today? So we have actually organized like some student activism around this, and thinking about mental health reform and housing reform, and, you know, interrogating our relationship with policing, for example, all of those kinds of things. And then also thinking about like, how can we create, you know, our own Perkins 28s? You know, how can we create those physical spaces, or I guess now virtual spaces, where people can be in community with each other, not necessarily around activism or trauma or harm, but just around joy. So that's a lot of the work that we've done. And then there's also the idea of, you know, maybe we need some posthumous degrees for these folks who were expelled from the university. So there were 8 that were expelled, only 2 were readmitted. So what about the rest of them? Some of them, you know, like not only were they expelled, but they got this black mark kind of put in their alumni file. Even for the ones that got readmitted, there was this black mark in their file. So every time they would apply for a job, people would ask, what, you know, Harvard, what was the suspension all about? And the response would be, you know, we can't really talk about it, but I can't recommend that you hire this person to work at your boys' school. I mean, that kind of damage really lingered and changed the trajectories of those folks' lives. And it seems to me that the least that we can do is give them the degrees that they would have gotten had this not happened.
Yeah. Just to build on that, I mean, that's one piece that we're pushing on, and we're going to continue to push on. You know, one thing about these unearthing these kinds of histories within a university context, and there's a Harvard and Slavery project that's going on now that was initially quite resisted by the administration, and is now a much bigger and bolder and broader interrogation of that, that's been given new energy, of course, this summer and in these times. But one thing that I would really like to, I would hope, is that this allows us to really do more of this archival digging, devote some resources to graduate students and undergraduates and scholars at Harvard who are interested in unearthing some of this history, so that what's lurking there in the archives can be unearthed. And then the other thing is that you know, our undergraduates and graduate students are so extraordinary. I'm in awe of them all every time. The older I get, the more I'm like, my gosh, I'm so glad I graduated when I did. These kids are, first of all, I would never get in now, but but they are so creative, and they're so outside the box in every way. And they're already often running with all these ideas about a virtual arts exhibition and podcasts and all of these other kinds of things. So that's another piece of this, is the kind of creative piece that that we can also preserve and archive, that can be a kind of record of this moment.
So we have a couple of questions in the chat. I know Mark asked, can you talk more about the lighted lamp and the other places that were, how much do we know about some of the bars and spaces that were mentioned in these, you know, in these tribunal records?
Yeah. Kamille, you want me to take that?
I mean, I don't know anything about that, so I think that you should.
Yeah, I actually don't know a lot. And it's certainly from the archive that exists here, and I've been through most of the records. It was a couple years ago now, but most of the references to these places show up in the context of, and this is actually very important too when we're talking about queer space. in the context of it was the place that the students could go to be relatively freer, right? These places in Boston, Cafe Dreyfus, the roast
Rooster and
Rooster, and then the Light and Lamppost. That these were places where the students could get off campus and become more free and to do things that they might not have done on campus, even in Perkins 28. So it becomes this respite away from campus, which is itself interesting, right? Because they are, even in their testimony, they're talking about these places, and they're really only references. There are not like rich descriptions of, you know, how many bar stools there were and, you know, what the people looked like, and even the kind of gender breakdown or dynamic, where these bars where men and women went, where these bars where people were, I mean, there's some suggestion that there were kind of drag performances, whether they were kind of, you know, official kinds of entertainment, or whether this was something that was more of a sort of practice, right, of transgression. Unclear about that, but clearly these are places where people are experimenting, and they're experiencing a kind of liberation or freedom that they explicitly cannot get at Harvard. The other thing that becomes important in this is that these places become constructed as deviant because they are off campus, because they are working class, and because they are, you know, these sort of unsavory Boston faggots. As if these older, you know, men in these cases were luring these students and sailors who are coming into port. There's a lot of stuff about sailors, which is interesting. That they're luring them there, and there is lurking in, it's sometimes quite explicit, but it's also implicit in the language. There is this suggestion that this kind of working class off-campus space in Boston is sort of tainting our students, is converting them, is, you know, luring them into what they otherwise wouldn't do because these are good Harvard boys. Right, and so there's a sense of the role that these places play becomes its own kind of class marking of class difference, as well as racial differences in some cases, and gender and sexuality deviance. So there's a lot of intersectionality going on just in the you know, unfortunately there isn't a richer kind of description of this, and I don't know if there is in the historical record either, but it's something that's a good project. Go find the spaces. Yeah.
So I think Ken had a question.
Yes, hi, thank you. This is really great. I'm just curious if you could put this in perspective. Was this happening at other universities, or was this just happening at Harvard, as far as you know?
Kamille, you wanna
I mean, my understanding is that this was pretty typical. I don't really have many other details beyond that, but it was, you know, a no-no to express any sort of behavior beyond this very narrow construction of masculinity. That's my understanding. Tim, I don't know if you want to add.
Yeah, I mean, from what I know from the kind of the myths and folklore of places like I went to Columbia, for instance, for graduate school, and there were all sorts of tales about the early days at Columbia and Harlem at the time, which was a kind of multi-ethnic community that was becoming more predominantly African-American at precisely this moment of prohibition. There were all sorts of speakeasies. I mean, New York is sort of famous for all of these kind of underground places where people could drink illegally and so forth. And those places, many of them became queer. Oh my God, I'm blanking on Gay New York. George Chauncey, my gosh, George Chauncey at Yale has written this amazing book called Gay New York, which actually documents what he calls a gay world in New York City before World War II, and it coincides with precisely this moment. And you know, all of the schools are implicated in the gay world of New York. So there were those stories. The other thing that was interesting in the secret court documents is that there was an enormous amount of anxiety on the part of Harvard administrators about this leaking, about this being public. Malcolm, you're so wonderful. You're pulling your books off the shelf. I love it. About this leaking to the press. The only press coverage that this got that we know of is after Eugene Cummings kills himself in Stillman Infirmary. And that's the moment where it gets into the Boston press. And Harvard had been tried. That's why one of the reasons why they had a secret court aside from the administrative board is because the administrative board often had a lot of eyes on it. So the secret court was done in a very clandestine manner so that it wouldn't leak. And so when Eugene Cummings kills himself in the Harvard infirmary, right, it becomes news. And so then administrators have to go on the record, and one of them refers to him as engaging in very queer activity. And so it's a way that so they mark him that way, but that's it. That's all they say. But behind the scenes, there's all this anxiety about, we don't want this to get out. And some of the people who give testimony say, oh, are you kidding me? This happens at Princeton and Yale and everywhere else. Like they're clearly like alert to, a couple of them are alert to, at least rumors that there's other things going on at the other schools, some of them.
Yeah, and actually, so Smearage, who was the last suicide that happened. So he kills himself in 1930. But right after the court wraps up, he sends this letter to the administration. And I feel like the undertone is, I can blow this wide open at any time. And he says, Harvard has a reputation for this sort of thing that is nationwide. I have heard a most uncomplimentary song Princeton sings of Harvard and along this theme. And then later on, he talks about how, he wishes that he hadn't named any names. And that it's unfair that, these 8 folks have been punished when, he is one of 10 times that number. So he alludes to this even bigger community at Harvard. Dartmouth comes up, like there's a similar group at Dartmouth. So it was happening other places.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question.
Yeah. Let's see if I don't think we have another raised hand. Oh, Malcolm. Yes, yeah. Oh, I will unmute you. Sorry, Malcolm, you're not unmuted yet. I'm not succeeding in doing that. Joan, can you do that?
Okay, there you are.
Oh, there you are.
There you are. Okay. I worked at Harvard for nearly 40 years in the library system. It's no great secret that the previous archivist was a gay man, and so you may find more stuff there than you would expect. The 1920 thing made a big splash in 2002, but it's not unique. It was going on everywhere. People were getting kicked out. People were committing suicide. And if you want to do a history of Harvard, you should get at some of the people before they die. I mean, Peter Gomes is gone, and he was a treasure. But Diana Eck and her lover are still there at Harvard. She's a professor of religion in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences and in the Divinity School, which is one of the schools I worked in. This book that I held up here, Sons of Harvard, Toby Murata was in the class of 1967. He had 2 doctorates from Harvard. He was at the School of Education when I was there in the 70s, 60s. And a questionnaire was sent out to all of the class of 1967 to ask them to submit a little bio, what they've been doing in the last 10 years. And this was for the 1977 10-year reunion, which is a big deal reunion at Harvard. And Toby decided he would get in touch with 10 people whom he knew who were gay. He got in touch with lots of others who wouldn't participate. But he wrote this book called Sons of Harvard, which is what the hell they've been doing in the last 10 years and how being gay made a difference in their lives. And they were obviously out. and were in significant positions, as most Harvard graduates are. And so this was a terrific book, and it made a big splash at the time. But if you're really interested in gay history at Harvard, you don't start in 1920 and you don't end in 1921. It's Harvard, for me as a gay man, was always a very welcoming place. The requirement was that you didn't screw up and that you didn't embarrass the institution. And there was no question about whether I was gay or not. One of my bosses said she remembered when I told her. Well, I never did. But it was just generally understood. The fact that you worked in the library with 1,200 other library staff members, you got to expect some of them are going to be gay. Well, the predominance was pretty profound, but it's an interesting institution. What Lawrence Abbott did was a product of his time, and it was not untypical. But in fact, Harvard has always been a very welcoming community for gay people. Go talk to Diane.
Malcolm, that kind of actually also brings up, we've got time maybe for one more
I'm
question.
sorry, I'm hogging it.
No. I'm just keeping an eye on that. What you're talking about really brings up this question that someone has asked in the chat, which is, what can we do now to help create those kinds of welcoming spaces, right? The kinds of spaces that you're talking about that you found. What can we do now in terms of, well, especially right now in terms of the virtuality of a lot of our interaction, right? What can we do now to create those kinds of welcoming spaces?
Those welcoming spaces exist. You don't need to create them. This isn't 1920, and it's not 1967. I highly recommend reading Eric Cervini's book, The Deviants' War, which is a history of the US government's persecution of gay people. It all fits, it's part of a pattern, and I'm probably losing it, but you know, these spaces like the Prentice, or I'm sorry, what was the
Perkins 28, yeah, it's true. So
Perkins.
yeah.
That was a graduate student dorm, by the way, and it still is.
What do you think, Kamille and Tim? Do you think that, like Perkins, they can create themselves, or does the institution, or all of us here in the call, what role do we have? I'm afraid that's going to have to be the last question. So as we've already passed, yeah.
I mean, I think that there's definitely a lot more work to be done. Because while this is not 1920, it's like for both good and ill, right? So not just the general profile of students at Harvard has changed unbelievably. And I don't think that the policies in place at Harvard have necessarily kept up with that diversity. And we know that LGBTQ students are seeking mental health counseling, at greater rates than their straight cis peers. And we know that there's not enough counselors to meet the need. There's still difficulty, if you are looking for gender neutral housing, you may not be able to access that. Or if you need a gender neutral restroom, there's not guaranteed to be one in every building on campus, right? And so some of this is like, yes, Harvard is old and things are hard to change, but I really believe that institutions should allocate resources and time to the things that they say that they value. And so for me, I would like to see a greater commitment on the university's part to making sure that Harvard is inclusive, not just of different sexualities, but also different gender expressions, and that we all have better vocabulary for talking about those things.
Yeah, I mean, I've been at Harvard on and off since 1989 in the, the crucible of the AIDS crisis. And when I was not out, and I came out after college, and then came back as a faculty, as a tutor, and then as a faculty member. So I've been at Harvard for a very, very long time. And, I think it would be unwise and untrue to deny that there have been certain changes in the direction of real progress for LGBTQ folks, or at least some folks within the community. There's no question about that, right? I was part of the group of people that was trying to get Harvard to add gender identity and expression to its non-discrimination policy in 2005, and there was great opposition to that, and that's within the last 2 decades in this century. So, there are still battles to be had. One of the things that I'm always mindful of as a teacher, and I also live in residence in one of the houses at Harvard, is kind of where students are at right now. And I agree with Kamille, the student body has changed dramatically in all sorts of ways. And one way that's, I think, quite positive is that LGBTQ students are a force now. Right? When I first started teaching at the Kennedy School 15 years ago, this is my 15th year at the Kennedy School. When I started teaching there, I went to a caucus meeting. That was a pretty sad gathering. I mean, no disrespect to the people who were there. There were 4 or 5 folks and me, because I was the only out faculty member, and was for many years the only out, and I was the first in 2005, 2006. And now you go into a caucus meeting and it's like, they have 110 people on their listserv. And not all of them are self-identified as LGBTQ, but they're interested and they're allied and they're supportive. And a good chunk of them are. And the same is true of the college and most of the other schools. And so I think there's been a growth in the number of the sheer critical mass of folks, what they're doing, what they're demanding, what their presence is. But I also think that there is real work to do, and around issues of housing, issues of curriculum, issues of faculty representation, issues of mental health services, right? I mean, there was a time where we had 1 person in mental health services for the entire college who was queer identified and who had any expertise in counseling and so forth for LGBTQ folks. And so, and then that person left, and it was a 2-year void before we got another person, right? And so there are things that we're really struggling with. And then I think there are things that we've made great advances with. And, where I always am for any given moment, as much as I'm a historian and I like the long view and the long arc, and I love Eric Servini's book, and yes, there's been lots of change over time. However, Eric Servini was actually a former student of mine. But where I am as a university citizen is always trying to figure out, like, who's not being served best, who's being left behind, who's not visible, whose needs are not being met, and to go there, right? I take that view when I'm thinking about policy, public policy. I take that view when I think about social movement organizing, and I take that view as a faculty, mentor, advisor, teacher. I want to make sure that we're reaching everyone. And as long as there are people who are struggling, we still have work to do.
So I think that's a great place to end. Thank you, Tim and Kamille, for talking about this. And thank you, everybody, for coming and asking your questions and bringing kind of your enthusiasm to this conversation. It's a very interesting history, and I think important to talk about. So Joan, I don't know if there's anything else we need to say before we close out.
No, basically, thank you all so much for being here. I will be following up with an email with a lot of these resources that Tim and Kamille talked about, but also that were linked in the chat. We all have a lot of reading to do, or some of us may not have that much more reading to do. I have a lot of reading to do. Thank you for being here. Thank you for taking part in this conversation, and for working with the History Project. Like I said, we're Boston's Queer Community Archives, and keep an eye out on us. We have more events coming up in September about community archives, about interpreting queer history. And I will say LGBTQ History Month is coming in October, and we have some fun things planned. So have a good night, everyone. Tim and Kamille, thank you again. And yeah, have a great night. Thank you.